Welcome to the Conversation Weekly. As the world marks 5 years since the COVID pandemic, this week we hear the surreal story of what happened in Iquitos, a remote city in the Peruvian Amazon that was one of the world's worst hit places during the first wave of COVID-19. If you ask people in Iquitos what it was like to live through COVID, many of them mention one man.
The man who came to be known on the street colloquially as Uncle COVID. His name was Juan Pablo Vaquero.
This is Japhy Wilson, a researcher who recently spent a year living in Iquitos, asking people to remember their experiences of the pandemic. Reports of what happened to Uncle COVID first emerged in the local press in Iquitos.
This man who had been taken to the main hospital in the city was pronounced dead. His sister wasn't allowed to see his body. She was told that he was dead. And she returned home, and 3 days later, he appeared at her front door, supposedly stinking of death. She asked what has happened to him, and he told her that he'd awoken in a pile of black garbage bags out in the jungle and had found his way home from there.
Around this time, in April 2020, rumours were circulating in Iquitos that the government had secretly opened a mass grave on the outskirts of the city.
He and his sister put two and two together and assumed that he had been dumped with a bunch of corpses out of this grave and had been awoken and had fought his way out of there and come home.
Uncle COVID's story stuck with people.
When I started interviewing people about COVID, his story kept coming up without me having to ask about it. Politicians, civil servants, medical professionals and so on, they would raise it as a kind of example of the ludicrous kind of urban myths that were circulating at the time of COVID, and they would laugh it off and say how absurd that would be, impossible, it never could have happened. But then when I was speaking to people in the favelas, the people who had been most hard hit by the pandemic, they would bring up his story in a kind of celebratory way. He had become a kind of folk hero as a kind of symbol of triumph in the face of impossible adversity.
The first COVID lockdowns in 2020 were a surreal and terrifying experience for all of us. In many wealthy parts of the world, though, states stepped in to help people whose livelihoods had disappeared. But not in Iquitos. And it led to an extreme case of total societal breakdown. People were left to fend for themselves, fighting for oxygen for their loved ones, and forced to put themselves in danger to survive. The story of what happened in this city serves as a warning that even after facing multiple crises, 5 years on, few places are ready for the radical reckoning needed to avoid the same thing happening again. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. As a lecturer in human environment interactions at Bangor University in Wales, Japhy Wilson studies the relationships between people and the places they live.
I'm particularly interested in exploring the spaces on the very edges of the global capitalist system, primarily resource extraction zones in places such as the Amazon.
Japhy had been researching the oil industry in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and in late 2019 he decided to travel further upriver into Peru to spend a few months in the city of Iquitos.
Iquitos is the largest city in the world with no road access. You can only access Iquitos by flying in from Lima, it takes a couple of hours, or you can take a cargo ship from the end of the last road in the kind of Andean foothills, and that takes 3 days by cargo ship. So it really is way out in the middle of nowhere.
Iquitos was founded in the 18th century as a Jesuit missionary settlement called Santa Barbara de Iquitos, named after the indigenous Iquitos people of the area. Its history is littered with booms and busts. First, rubber in the 1880s.
There was a huge influx of venture capitalists from all over the world, primarily Europe, coming in to invest in the industry, and they built in a very short space of time this kind of fantastical modern European city in the depths of the Amazon jungle, with these elaborate mansions, their exteriors tiled in these beautiful Portuguese azulejos and with these dainty kind of French ironwork balconies and so on, everyone parading around in their finery and supposedly getting their linen washed in Paris. But the flip side of this, which only kind of came to light around 1910 or so, was that the entire industry was sustained by enforced indigenous labour.
Around 1911, rubber from plantations in colonial Malaya, which is modern-day Malaysia, began to flood the global market and outcompete the wild rubber of the Amazon.
Very rapidly, all those venture capitalists went off in search of the next boom somewhere else, and the city fell into decline. And even today, if you walk along the boulevard in Iquitos, you can see the ruins of some of these mansions overgrown with jungle and so on.
Since then, Iquitos has survived through more extractive booms. Timber, then barco, a natural insecticide. And then in the 1970s, oil was discovered in the surrounding jungle.
And that drove a new influx of foreign capital. Multinational oil companies all rushed in to explore the region. And Iquitos again became a kind of logistical, strategic hub for that industry. At the same time, Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel was growing in power in Colombia, and most of the raw material for cocaine was being produced in the foothills of the Peruvian Andes and was then being shipped down through the river network and across into Colombia. And Iquitos became a key logistical hub for the cocaine industry at the same time.
Today, oil and cocaine are still important components of the city's economy, though on a lower scale. What's it like walking down the street now in the 21st century in Iquitos?
Iquitos is located on the confluence of three huge rivers. You've got the Amazon and then two other rivers called the Yataya and the Nanay. And it's built on this high table of raised land initially, but it quickly exhausted that space as the city expanded. Officially, the city, it's now a city of around 500,000 people, but it's probably somewhere around 700 or 800,000 people. So it's a metropolis.
As the city grew, it expanded out onto the floodplains of the Amazon in a latticework of houses that shift height depending on the season.
The Amazon rises and falls by about 8 meters a year. So in the dry season, if you walk through these parts of the city, you're walking up on these spindly, stilted huts 8 meters above the riverbed. And then there are all these other huts that are kind of sitting on their rafts on the riverbed. And then in the rainy seasons, the place changes, the river rises and the huts rise, and everyone's moving around on canoes through between the huts.
The social life of the city is centred around huge, vibrant markets.
Where all the produce from the surrounding jungles is brought in.
And it's hot. The average temperature throughout the year is around 26 degrees Celsius or 79 degrees Fahrenheit. And that makes life inside the zinc-roofed houses pretty intolerable during the day.
And that means they're out on the streets. And so it's an extremely intense social space. There's a lot of music, there's a lot of vibrancy. It's a wonderful place, actually.
Tonight, the Chinese city of Wuhan and nearby towns locked down. No trains, flights, or mass transit.
Europe has now become the epicenter of the pandemic, with more reported cases and deaths than the rest of the world combined, apart from China.
The world's largest COVID-19 lockdown is now in effect for India's more than 1.3 billion people.
As COVID swept the world in March 2020, people in Iquitos weren't particularly worried.
They assumed that their isolation would kind of protect them from the disease. But Peru announced a national lockdown, quite a draconian one, on the 16th of March 2020. And the very next day, the 17th of March, was the first announced case in Iquitos. And this was a worker at a tourist lodge in one of the lodges in the jungles around the city. He was living in one of the favelas, one of these very kind of cramped parts of the city, and he brought it back there, and then it very rapidly spread from there.
And it's got this kind of ignominious title as one of the cities in the world that was worst hit by COVID, isn't it? How bad did it get?
That's right, yeah. It's not entirely clear exactly how many people died because the public health system broke down and the mechanism for recording deaths broke down. But at the height of the pandemic, there was an official recording of about 100 deaths a day, and medical professionals imagine that it was probably more like 200 or more a day, but no one's exactly sure. But if you look at the kind of infection levels, it was one of the worst hit cities in the world.
There are several reasons why Iquitos was hit so badly in the first wave of COVID in early 2020. The first is the level of poverty. 60% of the population are classified as poor or extremely poor, and 70% work in the informal sector.
And that means that As they say in Iquitos, people live dia a dia, from one day to the next. People have to go out onto the street and find, by hook or by crook, enough money to put food on the table that night for their families. So in that kind of situation, you don't have the luxury of living under lockdown. It's not an option for you. You can do it maybe for 1 or 2 days, but then you absolutely have to go back out onto the street. And so despite the Peruvian state imposing this draconian lockdown, people in Iquitos simply couldn't obey it. Had to go out and find money. The second issue was that the way most people sustain themselves is in one way or another connected to these huge markets. In these markets, people are in very, very close proximity to each other. The Belén market, which is the biggest market in Iquitos, there was a study conducted in early May of 2020, so only about 6 weeks after the first case had been discovered. It tested 200 traders in this market, and it found that 199 of the 200 either had COVID or had already had COVID by that point.
Wow. And
you can imagine then people coming in there, contracting COVID and then going back out, spreading back out across the city. The homes themselves are overcrowded, often have several families living in them. People are living with their elderly relatives and so on. So that was a further factor. On top of all that, you have the extreme deficiency of the health system in the city. Peru is celebrated, or was celebrated, prior to the pandemic as a kind of neoliberal success story. It followed all the prescriptions of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in terms of imposing austerity and privatizing its services, including its health services, investing an incredibly low proportion of its GDP in health. And to the extent that there is a functioning kind of public health system in Peru, it's extremely, extremely deficient. There was only 7 ICU beds in the main public hospital in Iquitos at the time that COVID broke out. And then on top of all that, the city is expanding in an uncontrolled way into the jungle. There's no sanitation system to speak of. The rubbish removal system is very poor. You've got all of these dysfunctional infrastructures, which are kind of perfect places for stagnant water to accumulate. And these are the conditions in which malaria, dengue, leptospirosis, cholera, and so on flourish. In the months immediately prior to the outbreak of COVID, there was a twin epidemic of dengue and leptospirosis in the city, which had already brought this dysfunctional health system to its knees. So all of this added up to the context in which COVID then arrived.
When Gareth was 14, he was in a relationship with an attractive young teacher at his school, and he thought he was the luckiest boy in the world. But when she walked out of his life, everything started to unravel. 35 years later, everyone's acting like it never happened, and Gareth wants to understand why.
How about the truth? How about we do that first and then we work out where we're going to go from there? How about the truth?
This new 4-part series is about who gets to be a perpetrator and a victim. To listen, just search for Lucky Boy wherever you get your podcasts.
Japhy Wilson was back in the UK during the worst months of the pandemic. He continued to follow news reports about how bad the situation had got in Iquitos.
They've been waiting patiently for hours, queuing round the block to refill an oxygen tank that a relative suffering from COVID-19 is depending on to survive.
It's been 6 months since the first COVID-19 case was confirmed in Peru. And even though the country imposed a strict lockdown early on, it's now registered more deaths per capita from the virus than almost any other nation.
As the world began to open up again in mid-2022, he decided to go back to live in Iquitos, taking his wife and 2-year-old child with him.
We found a place in one of the favelas. We rented a place there and we lived there for a year.
What was it like?
It was very cramped conditions in terms of how very small houses with very concentrated populations in very close proximity to each other. There were no roads there. You had to walk into it. It took us about, I guess, 5 or 10 minutes to walk to our place through this kind of dense network of streets. It wasn't in one of the flooded areas, actually. So everybody out on their streets, so you'd walk through it along a narrow path between the huts, and everybody would be out in front of the houses in their porches, and you'd be called in to have a drink here or to have a chat there. It was an incredibly social, vibrant, friendly place. It was the poorest place I've lived, I suppose, in terms of economic income and so on, but it was unquestionably the richest in terms of the strength of the community, and we had a wonderful year there.
Okay. So while you were there in that year in 2022, you began interviewing people about life during the pandemic. You wanted to really dig down and understand what that was like for the people who lived there. So how did you go about doing that research?
I knew there'd been this huge disaster, but everyday life was just carrying on as normal, and people weren't talking about it. I got the sense that it was being kind of deliberately forgotten. And as soon as I started talking to people about it, all kinds of extraordinary stories emerged. Almost everybody had lost at least one close family member during this first wave. And I've done research in a lot of difficult conflict kind of situations and so on in the past, but I've never encountered so many people breaking down in tears as they did in this case.
It was in these conversations that many people mentioned the story of Uncle COVID, Juan Pablo Vaquero, the man who walked home after being left for dead. From the local press reports, he knew the name of the area where Vaquero's sister lived.
And so I went there and asked around, and very quickly I found his sister, and she told me that he had left the city and no longer wanted to discuss his experience, but she was willing to tell me her experience.
Vaquero's sister is called Purificación Chota Chavez. She earns income by buying fish from riverside markets and then grilling it over charcoal in front of her home to sell to passers-by.
But because of the lockdown, a lot of the markets in Iquitos became clandestine and operated nocturnally. So whereas she would have previously gone to the market at 5 a.m, she now had to go to the market at midnight.
One night in April 2020, she was out buying fish and got back very early to avoid being seen by the first police patrols.
She found her brother collapsed on the floor having some kind of seizure. He didn't actually, although he's known as Uncle COVID, he didn't actually have any of the symptoms of COVID, but it's thought that he had probably had a stroke or something like that. She took him to the hospital. This was at the height of the first wave, and while he was being examined, she was waiting in the corridor when she told me that she saw several people dying in front of her during those hours. In her words, they were dying like chickens with the plague. And she says that she was then informed that her brother had died. She wasn't allowed to see his body and was forced to go home. And she was in mourning for a couple of days, but then again, her economic circumstances forced her to return to work. And as she was getting up to go to the market at midnight, again, she heard her neighbours shouting that her brother was outside the front door. And she thought it was some kind of cruel joke initially. And then she opened the door and found him. And her neighbours were saying, "Don't let him in, don't let him in." Everyone was terrified. Even her family members were saying, "Don't let him in." But she invited him in and bathed him and asked him about what had happened, and that's when he told her his story.
Other people told Japhy just how desperate the situation got in the first wave of COVID. There were stories of people raiding garbage sites trying to find food, and one of an armed gang that invaded an alligator farm, hacked up the animals with machetes and took them away, either to eat the meat or sell it. One of the biggest problems the city faced was a lack of oxygen.
The main hospital in the city only had the capacity to generate between 20 and 30 10-litre tanks of medical oxygen a day. This oxygen plant wasn't working properly. And then that was combined with 2 private providers, and they could each produce about 30 tanks as well. So you had a combined productive capacity in the city for oxygen tanks of between 80 and 90 a day at the time of the outbreak of the pandemic. And it's estimated that, the demand was at least 10 times that, right? So demand massively outstripped supply, and in that situation, in a kind of free market society, you have a flourishing market, and it turned into a flourishing black market. Originally, the price of a full new tank of medical oxygen, I believe, was something around in the region of 700 soles, which is about £130 or something like that. It very rapidly went to well over 5,000 soles, well over £1,000. And this is in a city in which the average income is only 1,000 soles a month, right? So clearly it was impossible for the vast majority of the population to imagine participating in this market. It was only the kind of middle class and elite who could participate in it. Initially, the central government had pretty much washed its hands of Iquitos, wasn't sending it any assistance, but towards the end of April, footage started appearing in the international press of morgues in Iquitos overflowing with bodies wrapped in black garbage bags. And the central government was kind of pressured to do something, and so it started sending about 60 tanks, new fresh tanks of oxygen a day into the city on emergency flights. Sources in the regional government and in the health sector tell me that well-placed positioned members of the regional government were stealing a proportion of these tanks and then selling them on the black market. Hospital staff were involved in charging for refillings, but the private providers were involved in ramping up prices for both new tanks and refillings. There was a whole kind of complex black market that emerged, and a single tank would only last you between, depending on the severity of your condition, between at the most 12 and as little as 5 hours. And so people were constantly in desperate search of oxygen to keep their family members alive.
And you spoke to one woman, didn't you, about what that was like for her uncle, and you've kindly shared that recording with us. What did she tell you about what happened to him?
This woman is a primary school teacher, and she lost 4 members of her close family within the space of a week in the first wave. And she told me a story. It was really quite typical of many that I heard from other people. The story of her uncle.
He was without oxygen. They just couldn't find the oxygen.
Initially, they were treating him at home, but his case got increasingly severe, and so they decided they needed to take him to the hospital.
It was full, totally full. People were all over the place in the hospital looking for a bed, and there wasn't one for him, so we had him in a wheelchair.
She was trying to find a bed for her uncle, but that proved impossible.
You could see people getting out. They came running. They got off motorcycles. They got out of cars running, screaming, asking for help, and they simply fell dead there. They fell dead, and nobody came near. Not even the nurses nor anyone else, and everyone, including me, was screaming for help, but no one came near. I felt like I couldn't take it anymore, seeing the people there who were falling dead, here dead, over there dead, over here.
And she stayed with him while various other family members went in search of oxygen for him around the city, 24 hours a day, desperately trying to find wherever was clandestinely selling oxygen at that point. You know, she told me about how they would hear that there was oxygen somewhere being sold off, and they'd get there, there'd be a huge queue, they'd wait for a couple of hours, they'd find out that the oxygen there had run out, then they'd hear from someone else that somewhere else on the other side of the city was selling oxygen, and they'd rush across to the other side of the city, they'd get there, queue for several hours again, maybe that time they'd get a bottle, they'd rush back to the hospital.
Then his daughter comes, the daughter of my uncle, and they managed to get hold of some oxygen.
They'd get him hooked up to it, and then it would run out. According to her, on the black market, a lot of the time, part of the problem was that the tanks were only being half filled, and so they were only lasting a few hours.
When they finally let him into the hospital, 15 minutes later, my uncle died in there. They came out to say that he had already died. That is where he ended up dead.
What did the authorities do to try and deal with that situation and just the general kind of collapse of the health system and the way the city was functioning?
Well, many of the authorities, as I've mentioned, were involved in the black market themselves, right? But, and I'd really like to emphasise this, there were a lot of people, both in the regional government and in the health sector, who stepped in and stepped up and did extraordinary courageous work under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. One of the very difficult choices that had to be taken was the opening of this mass clandestine grave on the outskirts of the city. Towards the end of April, the morgues were overflowing. The municipal incinerator had broken down, and something had to be done. And so this decision was taken to do this, and to do it in secret, which was extremely controversial and made a lot of people understandably very angry. But from the perspective of the people that took the decision and were involved in the process, they said that there was simply nothing else to be done in that context. The general manager of the regional government, who had stepped in the absence of the governor, told me it was his role to recruit people to collect bodies, because the poor of the city, again, couldn't participate in the black market. And so they were dying in their homes or on the streets, and these bodies had to be collected and processed. And so he was charged with finding people to do that work. Most of the staff, the health staff, had kind of either quit or just kind of gone on sick, or were doing anything they could do to avoid coming to work, quite understandably in the circumstances. And nobody else wanted to do this work either. The only people he could find to do it were homeless youth who were addicted to pasta basica de cocaine, which is kind of the base from which cocaine is refined, or something like crack. And they were the only people that would do the job, so he recruited them.
They'd go to people's homes.
They'd go to people's homes, and there were literally people just dying on the streets as well. And they'd collect these bodies, and then they'd move them out to a refrigeration unit on the edge of the city, from which they were then transported to the mass grave. And he told me that they were very blasé about it, probably as a kind of performance in order to allow themselves to deal with the situation. He was paying them a day rate plus food. He told me a story about one day coming out onto the street after a long, harrowing day and seeing this pickup driving through the deserted city, stacked with black bags filled with corpses on their way to the mass grave. And these young homeless addicts were sitting quite happily on top of the corpses, eating hamburgers. And he told me that story as an amusing anecdote. As he got to the end of it, he actually, I think unexpectedly for him, broke down in tears. He didn't tell me why he was crying, but at a different point in the interview, he said that he felt that these were unsung heroes of the pandemic. You know, the people at the very lowest strata of Iquitos society had actually been the ones who had stepped in when needed.
I mean, it also just emphasises something that you look at a lot in your work, which is surrealism, the surreal nature, both of urban life, but also in situations like this when a pandemic hits a city. What have you learned from these conversations you had in Iquitos about how surreal this moment was for these people?
I think across the world, it was quite common in everyday conversations and in newspaper articles to hear about the pandemic being described as surreal, a kind of radical reshaping of every kind of dimension of everyday life, upending of all of our assumptions about how things should look and how things should be. And this was certainly the case in Iquitos as well, but in kind of different ways. The black market in oxygen is, the story of Uncle COVID is. There are other stories as well, a couple related to the mass grave. So the bodies were initially taken to a refrigeration unit on the edge of town, and I spoke to some of the people that lived in that area, and one woman who lived right next door to the unit told me in quite matter-of-fact terms that she could hear the dead mourning their deaths. And she told me that there was one day a black cloud hanging very low over the city that never rained. And she told me that she believed that that was the spirits of the COVID dead. I also spoke to a man whose job it was to drive the bodies from the refrigeration unit to the mass grave in the middle of the night, 2 a.m. or so, he'd make this run. And the military had lent the health directorate a truck to do this. And occasionally he drove the truck alone. And he again told me in a kind of matter-of-fact way that he was sure that he could hear knocking on the metal compartment inside the truck. And he also told me that he once he was sure he felt someone tapping him on the shoulder. And he said he just smoked his way through a packet of cigarettes and kept his foot on the accelerator. But these are the kind of stories that were told in kind of matter-of-fact ways coming to light, right? And I was interested in them, and I wanted to tell them myself because I think they are clearly a significant element of the everyday experience of that event and of traumatic events of that kind in which the coordinates of our everyday reality break down. And too often academics edit out these kinds of stories in the search for more kind of objective facts. But if you're trying to capture the everyday experience of this kind of situation, and it is an experience in which the division between reality and fantasy and dream and reality appear to be kind of disintegrating, then I think it makes sense to incorporate these elements into the way in which you tell it.
Japhy ended most of his interviews in Iquitos asking people whether COVID had changed life in the city.
And in most cases, people would reflect on it for a few moments and then they decide that it hadn't changed anything at all. And that certainly seems to be the case, right? In terms of exactly the same political, economic structures remain in place, exactly the same social dysfunctions perpetuate themselves. So there's been no significant change in that regard. And I think that's also the case, regrettably, at a planetary scale. I think the pandemic, it offered us a glimpse into the kind of abyss towards which we are rushing in terms of the kind of ecological crisis and so on. It was kind of like a harbinger of the future, I feel. And it was a wake-up call, and it was an opportunity to realise what we were heading towards and to take radical action while there was still time to do it. I'd also like to say that there's kind of, at least in the case of Iquitos, a more positive, I guess, side to the fact that nothing changed. And that's really embodied in, I guess, the story of Uncle COVID and why he became such a folk hero for the poor and the marginalised of the city, because he embodied precisely that survival and resilience in the face of everything. He kept going, and that the city as a whole has done that. And so, in that sense, I'm glad that nothing has changed.
Well, thank you so much, Japhy, for sharing your experiences and those of the people you spoke to in Iquitos with us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode. It was written by me, Gemma Ware, with production assistance from Mend Marawani and Katie Flood. It was Katie who voiced up the words of Uncle COVID's sister. Sound design was by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor. Thanks too for this episode go to Surreal Griffiths at The Conversation in the UK, who edited an article that Japhy Wilson wrote about his research. We'll put a link to that in our show notes, alongside some links to The Conversation's wider coverage marking the 5th anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes too. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com, and please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. It really helps us reach more people. Thanks very much for listening.